Okay, I think we can start.
Okay, why don't we get started? I'm Rachel Sherman. I teach in the Department of Sociology and the Institute for Global Studies. Could everybody pay attention? Sorry, just hard to have conversations going. And we are really excited about our visitor today, Nick Cullather. We also have a lot of events to tell you about, and I'm going to start by making a few announcements before I formally introduce Nick. I also want to thank the Institute for Advanced Study for everything, but in particular for sponsoring this event and every other event we call them up for and say, can we have some money? And they're very kind and say, sure, what's it for? But they almost always say yes, and we're all grateful for that. This particular event is co-sponsored by the Institute for Global Studies, which is my other department, and the AgriFood Reading Group. We don't put in money, but we put in labor, which, of course, is very important. This particular event is part of a university symposium, a 2-year-long symposium on abundance and scarcity that the Institute has organized. I think we're in the first year. Next year is the second year. It's also the beginning of a bunch of events on food issues, including a university symposium called How We Talk About Feeding the World, which will be held here on campus on March 3rd through 5th. We hope everybody can join us on that. Tracy Deutsch and Valentine Cadieux and a few other people are the main organizers for that. It's a 3-day event starting late Thursday, March 3rd, with a talk called The Short History of Feeding the World, American Universities and the Changing Discourses of Food. And it goes on through Friday through to Saturday. I also want to make a quick pitch for a course that Valentine Cadieux in Geography and I are doing, which will go over a whole year period of faculty, graduate student seminar, and we might let a few undergraduates in if they're high achievers, which is going to be called Food, Abundance, and Scarcity in the 21st Century. So those are all the things that are happening in the next year or so. That course will begin in the fall and run through the spring. Okay, without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce Professor Nick Cullather, an associate professor of history at Indiana University. I barely made it to this talk because I got so engrossed in reading his various bios and all the things about him and the books that he's worked on that I looked at the clock and went, oh no. That's probably why I'm sweating and my heart's beating. So anyway, I just want to say briefly how we stumbled upon Professor Cullather's work. I was reading another article and there was a reference to an article he published in 2004 called Miracles of Modernization, the Green Revolution and the Apotheosis of Technology, that was published in Diplomatic History. And it was such an interesting title, and I've always been interested in the Green Revolution, trying to sort this complicated animal out. And so I downloaded it, and I got totally engrossed, and then I looked him up, and I realized he was writing a book. And I thought, great, we've got to get him here to talk about it. And that's kind of what sparked his 2-day visit here. And that book has just come out. It's called The Hungry World. Our reading group has just read it. It's wonderful. And it just has been out for a couple of months. And even though it just came out a couple months ago, it's already getting reviewed. Just yesterday, it was reviewed by The Nation, an incredibly long and positive review. David Reif from The Nation describes it as a brilliant new book. And I know Professor Cullather has been invited by a number of groups and institutions to give talks on it, and I think we got in right at the right moment to get him here before he had to start saying no to these invitations. We're fortunate and flattered that you're here. And before I turn the floor over to you, which I promise I will do very soon, I want to say that he received his AB at Indiana University a few years ago. 1981, I guess, and he now teaches there in the Department of History. He received his PhD in history at the University of Virginia. He's an OAH, which I believe is an Organization of American Historians. Distinguished lecturer. He's on the editorial board of Diplomatic History. He's been a Fulbright Fellow in Singapore and the Philippines. He specializes in the history of intelligence, development, and nation building. And his first book is Illusions of Influence, The Political Economy of U.S.-Philippine Relations, 1942 to 1960s, was published by Stanford University Press in 1994 and earned him considerable respect as a young scholar of U.S. foreign relations. Even before he published that book, however, he had begun working on his second book, which was also published by Stanford University Press. And this one, I think, probably got a lot of press, called Secret History, the CIA's Classified Account of Its Operations in Guatemala, 1952 to 1954. And it had an unusual history of its own, from what I can see. In 1992, if I understand it correctly, the CIA hired Nick to write an internal history that was not going to be shared, originally classified and for internal distribution only, of the agency's Operation PB Success, which overthrew the Jacobo Arbenz government of Guatemala in 1954. He was given full access to the CIA's archives, and he produced a vivid insider's account intended as a training manual for covert operators, in which he detailed how the CIA chose targets, planned strategies, and organized the mechanics of waging a secret war. A few years later, for a very brief moment, the CIA went through a period of openness, and I believe that was during Clinton, correct? When it decided to share some of the histories it had contracted of its covert operations, and that was one of them. And they agreed to let you publish this account of this overthrow, which it declassified after making very few deletions. The book, Secret History, received high praise from the New York Times, which called it an astonishingly frank account, which may be a high watermark in the agency's openness. It was published in 2 editions, might have even made you some money on the market.
It's the only book I've ever written that's made money.
And it probably will be the only one. But since then, we've been lucky because Professor Cullather has turned his attention to this fascinating study of the Green Revolution, which is why we've brought him here today. And hopefully this book will make it around as fast and furiously as the other one. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce him to give a talk called World Food Prices Aren't Too High, They're Too Low. How cheap food is destabilizing the global economy. And we welcome you back to Minnesota.
Yes, thanks very much for having me. I want to thank Professor Sherman and the Global Studies program and the Institute for Advanced Studies and the AgriFood Study Group for sponsoring me here in fine style. I don't know, Rachel, if you've ever encountered this, but since I wrote this book, one thing started to happen to me, which was that I get invitations to attend these big development forums like Davos and things like this, and they assume that I have money to go to Biarritz or Gstaad or wherever they're having these meetings, and that I can, go on my own hook and speak to the crowd. And I don't know how to respond to that. I'm an academic. I have no money to. But I've been very well taken care of here at Minnesota. I don't know if you heard on the radio this morning, the NPR Morning Edition had a long story about the food crisis going on right now, in which they connected it to the events in the Middle East. And they had Robert Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, saying that there was very definitely a connection between food prices and what was happening in Northern Africa, and that it made the difference, he said, in a very pithy comment, between transition and revolution. And if the food prices continued to go up, it would radicalize these revolutions that was going on right now. And this is a drumbeat of stories which have come out in the past 3 weeks. If you read the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or any of the financial papers, the FAO has sounded the alarm about rising malnutrition in African cities. Russia, the Philippines, South Korea have all clamped down on food exports. The crisis has actually gone to the extent of causing India to break its own trade embargo with Pakistan and to begin trading with its neighbor. That's how desperate it is. There are official reports by the World Bank, the United Nations, the British government, the World Economic Forum at Davos, all of them claiming that commodity prices are hitting record highs, which is only partly true. They are record highs for the 21st century. What they don't say is just how unusual the 21st has been among the centuries so far. This has been a very unusual century. The index year against which the crisis is measured is 2002, which actually stands at the bottom of a 50-year-long decline in commodity prices. But 2002 was not a crisis year. 2002 is the normative year against which we measure this crisis. There were no food riots in the cities in 2002. There was only quiet misery in the countryside. Just taking the last month of that year at the bottom of this trough in food prices and just scanning through LexisNexis and the press, you can find that the Chinese press were reporting 92 million peasants were abandoning their villages and moving to urban slums. Indian villagers were starving next to government warehouses stuffed with grain. Hundreds of thousands of Mexican farmers that month blockaded the highways in order to protest against cheap American grain imports. And despite $32 billion in federal bailouts, American farmers were taking extra jobs at Walmart in order to stave off foreclosure. This, I want to point out, was not a crisis. That's not a food crisis when that happens. That was normal. So it indicates something about how we define a food crisis. A crisis is a moment when food prices are unusually high, not when they are normally abysmally low. A food crisis is when the crisis hurts consumers, not when it hurts producers. Between the lines, if you look at the current stories about the food crisis, you can see the news reports giving us an inkling of two major assumptions about agriculture, going back some 50 years or more, that I believe have culminated in and that serve to create the current situation. The first of those assumptions is that agriculture is a separate part of the economy. The report on the global crisis recently issued by the British government stresses that policymakers need to view food as, quote, a unique class of commodity that can have far-reaching diplomatic and social implications, and so therefore needs to be treated separately from the rest of the economy. Many countries are using price caps, export bans, anti-hoarding restrictions in order to contain the damage. And this is the way they phrase this. They actually talk about the possibility that inflation will leak out into the economy. So agriculture and food are this separate thing that have the capacity to contaminate the economy. They're external to the economy, separate in our conceptual makeup. Paul Krugman had a column recently in which he drew the differentiation between what he called core inflation and headline inflation. Headline inflation is the inflation that includes food prices. Core inflation, the real inflation, what we ought to be worried about, is only the inflation in the manufacturing sector and service sector of the economy. So the economy is cast as having an interior and an exterior, with agriculture being outside of the economy. That's the first assumption. The second is that it's unequal, both in terms of expectation and in terms of duties to the larger economy. Analysts have been looking for prices to firm up. This is what a recovery will look like when stock prices start to rise, when real estate prices start to go back up, when the prices on the shelves start to go back up, when wages start to rise again. This will be recovery. Prices for land, for advertising, for steel, for the new iMac. Once those start to rise again, then we'll know that economic health is returning to the economy. High prices are, in most of the economy, an index of recovery, except for two things: food and fuel. Those are supposed to go down. Growth of manufacturing and services, preferably at a stable clip of 3% or more, is regarded as the object of a good recovery. if we manage to get the rest of the economy growing at 3%, we'll have made it. Agriculture is expected to grow at 3%. The British report makes this plain. Unless we grow at 3%, we're falling behind. It has to keep pace with population growth, leaving unstated, of course, that housing and jobs and all the rest of it, that has to keep pace with population growth too. But only food is expected to keep pace as a preliminary condition with population growth. It's a prerequisite, price of admission, before you can really play the game of economic management. But this is often made explicit too. For instance, these small clarifications that sometimes find their way into the newspapers. This was in The Economist in the January 28th issue, a couple issues ago. This phrase: higher commodity prices, it says, act like a consumption tax, transferring income from households and companies which use the resources to companies and countries that produce them. As the producers tend to save more of their income than consumers, more expensive commodities bear down on demand. And I point this out not because this is an unusual statement, but because this is just so common. This is the little explanation that in the financial papers you just kind of pass over because it's so banal. They have to explain. They're writing in the financial papers for business leaders who expect that rising prices and firming up prices are a good thing. And they have to explain to them why it is that when, in this article, we're going to be talking about food now, it's actually the opposite, that that's a bad thing. So higher food prices are a tax. Now get this, they're a tax because the money goes to people who are, one, productive, and two, frugal. Those are bad things. Those are bad things because they don't contribute to the things which count as growth. So consumers and secondary producers have a superior claim to profits in this assumption because they generate the kinds of transactions which count as growth. So what I'd like to look at today is how things came to be counted that way, how we came to have an understanding of an economy in which agriculture was separate and unequal, and counted down, and counted in a way, and counted out, I guess is what I want to say, counted out of the rest of the economy. So I want to go back to core principles here. Our concept of an economy, I believe, has a built-in inequity. Agriculture, the occupation of an estimated 44% of the world's people, is seen as separate from and subordinate to the rest of the economy. I want to put this in a historiographical context because I think historians have been very good at analyzing enduring categories of dominance, race, class, gender, but not so good at analyzing transitory categories of dominance, which nonetheless can leave long residues in the form of policy and received wisdom. And one of these categories of dominance that flared into geopolitical significance in the middle part of the 20th century and then kind of disappeared from the discourse, leaving behind, as I say, this residue of policy and assumption that I think you can see in those little capsule summaries from The Economist and in the way we count things in the economy, is what was called at one time the agrarian problem. The global agrarian problem. Social scientists referred to it as the rural-urban divide. And it was sometimes just called the problem of backward areas, or more commonly, underdevelopment, which was generally understood to be synonymous with rural. Underdeveloped meant rural. In English, the concept of the economy, with a definite article, appears to have originated in the 1930s. Before that, political economists, people like Adam Smith and Franz Liszt and Mill and Marx, wrote about economy as a virtue of good governance. It was a noun, but it was a different type of noun. Governments had economy. in the 1930s, they began to talk about a separate sphere called the economy, in which economic rules and theories applied, a contained sphere of social practice, rather than as a quality or a virtue of good governance. About the same time, in fact, almost immediately, an associated concept, the concept of the agricultural sector, came into existence. It originated in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, where economic planners were singling out the rural sphere for either punitive or paternal attention. Stalin wanted to discipline the countryside, which failed to deliver food and grain on the factory schedule that he wanted it to. The Nazis regarded the countryside as, quote, the life source of the people and the breeding ground of the armed forces. And so therefore, the agricultural sector was entitled to special types of protection. But in both cases, the countryside had to be recognized as a distinct area separate from the economy, entitled to special legal protection, but also operating under separate and distinct economic rules, a contrasting set of laws and formulas that made it different from the rest of the economy. The agricultural sector as a concept displaced an earlier classification from political economy, the peasant. Before that, the concept was the peasant. And that was rooted in an older tradition. But the differences between the two, and there were some carryovers from the one into the other, but the differences are very instructive, I think. The peasant, to Marx or Mill, was a transitional figure, halfway between the serf and the urban proletariat, who would be replaced eventually, even on the farm, by wage labor in some form or another. So they were an object of romantic nostalgia, and hence deserving of the state's special paternal attention during this period of transition, when they moved from serfdom to full freedom. One day they would be full citizens, and that's reflected in our literature. Eugen Weber's famous book, Peasants into Frenchmen, gives you a kind of concept that the peasant is not quite a citizen, but someone kind of making the transition to full citizenship. And the peasantry was constituted as a social class, and so therefore its moods, its temperament, its violent outbursts were an object of constant fascination and concern to ruling classes all across Europe. Some of that carried over into the new concept of the agricultural sector, but there were also very crucial differences. The agrarian sector was seen not as temporary, but as a permanent category, a feature of all economies, whether they were primitive or modern, but one that proportionally shrinks in relation to the rest of the economy as modernization progresses, shrinks in terms of size and influence. It is also a material category, not a human category. It's a material category with necessary inputs, chemical, mechanical, irrigation, and desired outputs: food, fiber, timber. The people are written out of the agricultural sector. The temper of the people who live there, their desires, their moods, their torches and pitchforks are not part of the calculation. It's a purely material category. Now, Stalin tried to force the rural sector to produce food on an industrial scale and timetable. Germany and France, on the other hand, tried to isolate the countryside as a kind of pastoral preserve of an older way of life. The Bauerntum, as it was called in Germany, or in France, La France Profonde. And I actually understand from reading my Swedish spy novels that the Swedes also had a similar kind of concept of old Sweden, and the farmers received kind of special government protection in order to maintain a kind of idealized rural way of life. This was a part of this. And the concept of a separate agricultural sector came to Washington in the 1930s at the same time, too. But initially, at least, Franklin Roosevelt went a very different way. And it had to do with his understanding of what was causing the Depression. In 1931, then Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt made an address at French Lick, Indiana, which is generally described as his opening salvo in his bid to run for president 2 years later, or the following year. Governor Roosevelt gave an analysis of what had caused the Great Depression, which at that time was called the emergency. They didn't even have the name Depression at that time. It was caused, he believed, due to, quote, the dislocation of a proper balance between urban and rural life. He pointed to deserted farms, to overcrowded cities, to the Dust Bowl, to the gap in wages between farm and city. All of this indicating the decay of the rural foundations of American prosperity. What New Dealers wanted to do was reunite city and country in a single sector, to reintegrate what had become separate. And New Dealers attempted to allow farmers to recreate an urban wage scale by lifting food prices, by creating artificial scarcities. Regional development schemes like the Tennessee Valley Authority aimed to correct the separation between country and city by integrating industry into rural life and creating a new geography of the economy, not spatially separate as it was before. Early New Dealers like Henry Wallace, David Lilienthal, and other New Dealers wanted to globalize this New Deal. And they took a particular interest in Mexico, where Lázaro Cárdenas's experiment with ejido reforms, a system of land reforms and village communes, aimed to reverse what was seen there as a similar imbalance between country and city. But as the Depression wore on and the war clouds gathered, priorities began to change. The Rockefeller Mexico program, which began as an effort to raise farmers' incomes, switched to a goal of raising yields of wheat in order to enable Mexico to cope with wartime scarcities and dislocations of labor in part. In the United States, farm earnings in the first 3 years of the New Deal rose to parity with 1916, the best income year on record, and stayed there after that. When the Supreme Court threw out the Agricultural Adjustment Act 3 years later, policy shifted towards subsidies that held farm income steady while having as the main goal providing cheap, staple goods to grocery shelves in the cities at low cost. By 1939, according to the eloquent journalist Rebecca West, who's a terrific writer who I've discovered recently, she said that all countries, communist, fascist, and capitalist, had accepted, she said, the insane dispensation which pays the food producer worst of all workers. So this is a consensus that goes across all economic systems at this point. The notion of the economic sector is actually bigger than communism, capitalism, fascism. After World War II, dual economy theory, as it comes to be called, becomes a hallmark of post-war development economics, and consequently of the new politics of foreign aid. In Asia, which was the key Cold War battleground in those early years, the United States confronted a continent that was almost entirely rural. This is something that is hard to conceptualize now, but in the late 1940s, when they beheld Asia, they saw a vastly rural continent. There were three large cities. There was Tokyo, there was Shanghai, and there was Bombay. But apart from, and these are all coastal cities perched on the edge of this gigantic, immense continent, thick with people, and all of it rural. And this was seen as the problem. Its rurality was the strategic threat. In Dean Acheson's phrase, it was an unknown world. And diplomats and economists doubted whether their ideas about government or economic laws had any bearing in this uncharted territory of Asia. George Kennan, who was sent to Shanghai in the midst of the hyperinflation and panic following the fall of Beijing to the communists, wired back to Washington, "We are deceiving ourselves when we pretend to have answers to the problems which agitate many of these Asiatic peoples." And economists at the time tended to agree. Supply-demand models and the concept of the rational man seem to apply only to the business manufacturing part of the economy, not to farmers. The Asian peasant, as he was construed at the time, represented a further degree of irrationality, even beyond the irrationality of the regular farmer. Economists drew charts, inverted and backward rising curves, to illustrate the peasant's perverse response to cash incentives. It was the phrase that was often used was leisure addicted. The peasant, as opposed to the rational man, didn't work for more money. The peasant worked in order to get more time off, and would use any gains that they had to slacken their effort. And so the reward structure of capitalism simply didn't work in this environment. John Kenneth Galbraith warned that economic doctrines were of little use, he said, in a setting where technological progress, as we understand it, is abnormal and in some sense unwanted. The Chinese Revolution substantially raised these stakes, returning to people's mind the concept of the Asian peasant, the peasant who is capable, through his own volition, of overturning governments and changing the political atmosphere of Asia. Social scientists and policymakers were desperate for ideas that would allow them to comprehend the way this unknown world of Asian rurality worked. So a whole generation of economists, many of them wartime refugees from Europe, took on this problem. The first generation, the economics profession was really enriched by an influx of emigre economists from Europe. Ragnar Nurksi from Estonia, Hans Singer, a Holocaust refugee who came to New York. Ragnar Nurksi worked at Columbia. Alberto Hirschman fled Germany, fled from the Holocaust, and went straight to the Federal Reserve Board as a leading economist. Paul Rosenstein Rodin studied at Vienna and then went to MIT to teach. So these refugees moved right into the top ranks of American economic theory. And together they devised the first body of development theory, which was called structuralism, which proceeded from a carefully wrought distinction between the modern or progressive sector, as they called it, the sector which responded to theoretical expectations, and the special situation of the rural areas. The first, this is John Kenneth Galbraith summing it up, he was the popularizer, the one who could sort of take these economic theories and put them out in front of a magazine audience. And he explained it this way: the first and very commonplace observation to be made about the underdeveloped and unprogressive countries is that they are all agricultural. There is no industrialized or substantially industrialized country in the world which can be said to be stagnant. There are, of course, many agricultural countries which can be so described. So you see the conflation of rural, urban, stagnant, vibrant, developed, undeveloped. The tautology is there. The fact that it's not visible to John Kenneth Galbraith, a very brilliant man, is an interesting thing. Structuralists identified the countryside, paradoxically, as both the source of poverty and as a reservoir of wealth waiting to be tapped. It was rich with certain things: surplus crops, surplus labor, surplus money. But all of this wealth was wasted in the countryside because peasants locked it into non-pecuniary assets, such as land and jewelry and children. The job of economic policy under structuralism was to siphon off, and they use these hydraulic metaphors, tap, siphon off these resources in order to create growth in the cities. Structuralists relied heavily on national incomes accounting, the calculation of GNP, or GDP as we call it nowadays. This is how we measure growth in an economy. And this technique equated calculability, the fact that you can assign a number to something, to value. So it had worth only if you could pin a number on it. And what they were most distressed about in looking at the Asian agricultural sphere was that they saw a whole area of the world that was rife with unnumbered types of exchange, what they called disguised income, disguised exchange. Habits of sharing food and labor that buried wealth before it could be counted. And for this reason, for the structuralists, or most of these structuralists anyway, overpopulation represented the most damaging special condition. Because high birth rates and high population in the countryside, not in the city, but in the countryside, sustain these customs of sharing, village welfare, make work, as they called it, that basically starved the modern sector of capital. All of this was creating equilibrium traps, vicious cycles. They had these phrases to describe what was happening to this money that was out there. They knew it was out there, and it was just waiting to come into the city, but it was trapped there through these different mechanisms. So development was a process of subtraction, subtracting these assets from the rural sector. Instead of wasting foreign aid on peasants, development was a process of stripping the agricultural sector of counterproductive surpluses, particularly of labor. Rural areas were full of extra people, explained Rosenstein-Rodin. Sons, cousins, uncles, and aunts who live on a farm and pretend to do something because they are there. If those people were removed from the land, agricultural output, far from falling, would increase. In fact, structuralists calculated the utility of rural labor at zero. This was part of their model. In other words, food was a resource like oil. It came out of the ground free. The farmer was not a generator of wealth, but a tax on wealth. Okay, so remember that Economist article of 2 weeks ago? The farmer is a tax. Theodore Schultz, who was not part of this school, he was part of the freshwater economists, as I've just learned they were called, at the University of Chicago, was kind of witnessing this from afar and noticed that his fellow economists assumed that peasants produced, he said, unbelievably little when they work. And many of them appear to be idle much of the time. This seemed to perplex these economists with their briefcases as they went through India, seeing these farmers sitting around apparently doing nothing. Zero-value labor was the basis for W. Arthur Lewis's Nobel Prize-winning prescription for development with unlimited supplies of labor. This was his famous article and famous doctrine. And in his memoirs, he described coming up with this. He said he was on a street in Bangkok in August of 1952 when it suddenly occurred to him that the function of the rural sector was as, quote, a reservoir of cheap labor for the other modern sector of the economy. And significantly, his model treated population growth as a neutral variable. He believed that with enough factory employment, fertility would accelerate growth. Those people would migrate to the cities, forming a cheap labor pool, and allow the modern sector to grow by drawing this labor from the countryside. India, he predicted, could easily manufacture enough exports to import a fifth of its food by 1980. And this was a very attractive idea to the Indian government. Newly independent regimes saw the potential in this. India's five-year plan defined agriculture, quote, as a bargain sector, which can produce the requisite surplus with relatively low investment and in a comparatively short time. Now today, I believe that the growth of Asian and African and Latin American megacities is regarded by most people and most observers as a kind of unintended byproduct of the development process, something that happened as a consequence of development. What that perception doesn't take into account is the amount of policy, planning, and aspiration that went into bringing it about. Taxes, price controls, duties, currency policies were all subtly or overtly designed to squeeze farmers and to make remaining in the countryside undesirable or unsupportable so that people would move to the cities. All of this was seen as accelerating a natural and desirable process of urbanization. From Robert Redfield and John Steinbeck in the 1930s, to Richard Hofstadter and Barbara Ward in the 1950s, to Rostow and Huntington in the 1960s, modernization was pictured as a journey from the country to the city. And we're not entirely past this. In November, there was a story in the Washington Post about the introduction of tanks to Afghanistan. One of the downsides, according to some people, was that tanks destroyed fields and farmers' livelihoods as a consequence for that. But the U.S. commander had an answer to that. Told the Washington Post that that was actually good. Because, he said, that made farmers travel to the district governor's office to submit claims for damaged crops and fields. In effect, he said, you're connecting the government to the people. You make people fully citizen when you move them to the city. So, in our conception, the way we think about modernization, agriculture is an inherently pre-modern or anti-modern activity, which can be endlessly modernized, but which can never be modern. It can never arrive and be more modern than the city. Consequently, the only way for rustics to enjoy full economic or social citizenship in our conception in a modern state is to move to the city. India took this notion of a pilgrimage literally. They had special trains called the Kisan Express that went to the countryside and picked up peasants and took them to Bombay, showed them the Art Deco skyscrapers on the waterfront, the steel mills, and the shipyards, and then took them home where they were to put pictures of these things in their village shrine and to talk about what they'd seen. Journey from the city to the country. Just by seeing it, they thought, just by seeing the city, it would change their mentality, snap them out of being peasants in a mental sense. Planners during the 1950s constructed what they called economic ladders, step-by-step processes, things like village industries and so forth, in order to help peasants make the difficult transition from the country to the city. And they concocted what they called disruptive mechanisms, different economic, I don't know what you call them, anti-stimuluses, that would make farming more difficult if for a temporary period of time in order to provoke more people to leave the countryside and find their true calling in the city if they were stubborn enough to want to stay. One of those was that India would not spend any money on fertilizer. Investments that might yield increases were expected to come from the farmers themselves. They, after all, had the surplus labor and the surplus wealth in order to bring it about. It was just a question of squeezing them enough in order to get it out. The panoply of laws designed to evacuate the countryside varied from country to country, but in most, price policy did the real work. Enterprise was punished, criminalized even, by anti-profiteering and anti-hoarding laws that applied solely to the farm sector. This is still the case in most of Asia, that there are these laws against hoarding, which, if you think about it, apply this to the manufacturing sector, that Steve Jobs can't hang on to the iPhone 4 until the release date because that's hoarding. Right? You can't hold that back until the price is right. But if a farmer tries to do that, you can wind up in jail for that. So forms of enterprise that are normal and admirable in the modern sector of the economy are criminalized in the agricultural sector. Cheap food meant cheap labor. which gave emerging Asia its competitive edge. The United States helped. It helped by depressing prices still further by flooding Asian markets with cheap surplus wheat. Things changed. After the structuralists, the next big wave of development theory was Rostovian theory. Walt Whitman Rostow and the Cenas group at MIT, which was a much more mixed group of social scientists mixed with some economists, came out of the structuralist tradition, but introduced a number of key innovations that helped adapt development economics to the counterinsurgency mission of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Rostow was chiefly known as for the concept of takeoff, which stressed that location and timing were crucial. Development aid, as they saw it, was a form of communication. The key breakthrough would not be steel, output, or GNP, but a new psychology in the country. And so Rostovian theory had important ramifications for agriculture. Rostow was certain that agriculture had no useful part to play in economic growth or development. Only urban manufacturing growth, in his view, could move fast enough in order to outpace population growth. But with 80% of the population living in the countryside and expressing their unrest by occasionally picking up an AK-47, you needed to do something. You could not neglect agriculture. And in fact, Rostow's first major foray into this field was an essay in Harper's Magazine called "Marx Was a City Boy," in which he argued that communist economic development policy was way too city-based, and that the United States needed to counter that by targeting the countryside in particular for this. But at the same time, they believed that that wasn't going to create any economic growth. So this is how dwarf wheat and rice, developed by the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations, first came to be used as part of the development arsenal. With artificial fertilizer and irrigation generally unavailable, the new strains didn't have tremendous yield potential at first, but their appearance created a sensation of movement, of growth, of things changing, a kind of psychological shock to the peasants that would further these Rostovian goals. The real engine of growth was still seen as being U.S. food aid, which kept urban wages low and created a psychology of abundance in the cities. By 1965, India's farmers had given up under the pressure of the planning regime, and the country depended on an unsustainable 11 million tons of American grain. Policy had to change, and it did. The Green Revolution at the time was hailed as a salvation of millions from drought and overpopulation. It was cast as a Malthusian crisis. But what it actually was that it rescued Asia from its years of catastrophic disinvestment of agriculture over the previous decade. Norman Borlaug recognized this. The real psychological change that he was trying to create, unlike Rostow, was the psychological change at the top. Dwarf wheat was a catalyst, he said, for policies that returned resources to the countryside, especially price supports, which gave peasants a rare chance to make a decent living. It was, in fact, genetically engineered, that was a term that Borlaug, I think, invented, to require inputs of irrigation, fertilizer, and knowledge that only the state could provide. It was expensive to produce. And to work, it required a radical revision in price policy. So it forced governments to rethink the whole equation of investment in the countryside. Afterwards, William Goud, who came up with the phrase the Green Revolution, stressed that price policy, not the technology, had made the difference. It shifted political and economic power away from the city and toward the country. And he saw this change as irreversible, but governments in Asia had other ideas. Proponents in India told Parliament that agriculture would always remain, quote, the handmaiden of industry, and that once production had hit a higher plateau, the process of resource extraction from the countryside could resume. Indira Gandhi rejoiced in the 1968 breakthrough and told the press that, quote, now one of our basic tasks is to tap the resources accruing in the rural sector. So once again, they're going to start stripping that rural sector out. Inspired by the Green Revolution, basic needs became a rallying cry for the global development community. Food production rose dramatically, but in the 1980s, debt crisis forced African and Latin American countries again to squeeze their rural sector for cash. Africa bore the brunt. James Speth of the National Resources Defense Council told Congress in 1986 what it was doing to the land. To meet the debt, governments were cutting back on fertilizer imports and investments in land management, and straining to increase cash crops and forestry exports, forcing farmers to take too much from the environment and put too little back. African nations had foreseen this crisis and responded with a bold plan to create their own green revolution, to break colonial trade patterns and to integrate into an African common market. The 1980 OAU Lagos Plan of Action made self-sufficiency in food and textiles and basic consumer goods the foundation of an African economic revival. But the World Bank and the IMF responded with its own plan, called the Berg Report, which reflected the neoliberal consensus at the time that dismantled the few remaining credit and subsidy programs in Africa. And so when famine scorched the Sahel region in the late 1980s, and food prices spiked in the 1990s, experts blamed it on climate and overpopulation. Now there's a new green revolution sponsored by President Obama, by Kofi Annan and Bill Gates in the Lugar-Casey Act. According to this, Africa ought to focus solely on agriculture. Hillary Clinton calls it the engine of growth for Africa. This takes the spatialization of the agricultural sector to a new level, designating an entire continent as the agricultural sector. Giving it a different set of prescriptions and formulas than the rest. And if you look at it, recovery policy for the industrial world focuses on restoring investment, consumption, job creation, infrastructure improvement. Development policy for Africa focuses on alleviating extreme poverty, primary education, maternal health, combating AIDS and malaria, and empowering women. Cambridge economist He-Jun Chang calls this development without development. Second, Green Revolution advocates have tools to increase productivity. What they don't explain is how increased productivity translates into increased incomes or economic growth. And historically, it hasn't. That was the problem that the New Deal wanted to introduce, the so-called paradox of plenty. If Africa is isolated economically this way, it makes it doubly unlikely that increases in productivity will translate into increases in national income or overall economic growth. So this half-century-long process of subordinating and separating agriculture has consequences. One of them has been the steady decline in the price of bulk commodities, wheat, rice, sugar, soybeans. We may now have reached the limits of that downward slope, but not because, I believe, of limits of climate or land, but limits of the endurance of the farmer. A recent poll shows that half of India's farmers want to quit. China, this is an amazing story in the Financial Times a couple of days ago, 76 million children abandoned in the rural areas, in rural villages, by parents who went to the city to seek work. And they interview one of these parents who frankly admits you can't raise a child. We're talking about one child here. You can't raise a child on the income you make from farming. Many of those who till high-risk lands, in particular, in which the expansion of the food supply really depends, have already given up, left the losing sector in order to seek a place in the winning sector. There, like the crowds in Cairo, they can demand food instead of having to grow it. With production stagnant or falling, prices have fallen into what economists are calling a super cycle of sharp, ruinous fluctuations in price. 2008 peak was followed by a 50% plunge in soy prices, and then this year's surge. The price of onions in India is up 80%. South Korea and the Philippines are facing shortages of fish and powdered milk. Countries around the world are reaching for the usual standby solutions, cracking down on hoarders and adjusting quotas and duties to force down local food prices. The Davos Economic Forum, in an uneasy forecast, questioned whether farmers could meet the twin challenges of demography and climate. If history is any guide, they can, but not if they don't get paid. A lasting fix is going to require more than an adjustment to allow cultivators to survive. It's going to require unlearning half a century of dogma, law, policy, and social science which regulates agriculture to a subordinate status. The global economy includes the global countryside, and the return of prosperity is going to have to begin there. Thank you.